as Senator Heitkamp has pointed out, that today is Bring Your Kid to Work Day, I would imagine that the bank sanctioning hearing is an interesting and perplexing conversation for many of us on this side of the aisle, much less this attentive young man. I will say that Senator Heitkamp also mentioned the fact that the need for legislation, enhanced sanctions, is important, and I know that Senator Lindsey Graham and others have been talking about that for the last couple of months from my perspective. And I do thank you both for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I thank you for having another hearing on such a critical topic. Whether it be unwarranted aggression in Eastern Europe, or propping up the Assad regime in Syria, or meddling in our elections here at home, Russia's actions have shocked the entire free world. I'd like to counter one of the main arguments used against the sanctioning of Russia. In 2014, the U.S. and the EU deployed targeted sanctions against Russia in response to its actions in Ukraine. Targets were determined by Treasury and State after a careful investigation and vetting process. Russia's economic growth slowed dramatically, and critics of our targeting claimed that we unfairly hurt neighboring countries and innocent parties. These critics conveniently ignored the dramatic drop in oil prices that occurred during the same time. And my understanding is that the drop of the oil prices had about a 4% impact on Russia's economy, whereas our sanctions had about a 1.4% impact thereabouts on the Russian economy, at least under 2%. So the drop in the oil prices had a significant impact, and our targeted sanctions had a targeted impact. The State Department released in December 2016 a report detailing the strong evidence it found that our targeted sanctions, and I quote, affected the financial health of the targeted firms or firms associated with sanctions individuals, while causing minimal collateral damage, which I think is consistent with the impact of 1.5% of the GDP. Mr. Ponce and Ms. Burns, you've already spoken to part of this. I want to ask you a similar question. I'd like to get your thoughts. Can targeted sanctions be used to effectively pressure those who threaten our national interests while limiting collateral damage on innocent parties or other countries?
Thank you, Mr. Senator. I couldn't agree more that the evolution of sanctions, I spent a lot of time on this in my written testimony, but the evolution of sanctions in recent years has clearly reflected a migration towards conduct-based sanctions that are targeted on behavior and are intended to minimize collateral damage on innocent parties or populations. I do think that the advent of sectoral sanctions we've seen in Russia, they are a new breed of targeted sanctions because they're not targeting illicit conduct. They're targeting pressure points in an economy, but they're attempting to do it in a way that is still tailored. And I think we've had some success with that. They're sophisticated. Our sanctions implementation, our compliance, our oversight in the market and in authorities here at home have made those sanctions effective. I think combining the two is the best approach. And the way we do that is to identify the key firms that are owned or controlled by the close associates of Vladimir Putin. To do that well, we need resources that are targeting what we call derivative designations. This is how this works. We identify at a primary level close associates that are associated with the illicit activity of the Russian government, that are the decision makers in the regime, that are engaged in illicit conduct, and they put all their assets in the hands of others, right, that are not named as sanctions, that evade our filters and our controls, the way that we operationalize this stuff. And then it's a game of cops and robbers. And as fast as we can identify those that are acting for, on behalf of, or supporting the regime, the faster they continue to change color, change shape, change form. We can keep up with them, but we need to be resourced to do it. Yeah. And when you've got Iran on the radar screen, and North Korea, and ISIS, and all the other challenges that we face, this is why we need the task force. Yes. And in getting to the task force, we should also make sure that we're resourcing targeting over at OFAC and at TFI to specifically go after sanctions, to levy sanctions against those that are close to the regime and that are holding assets in the names of others that are materially significant to the Russian economy. I think that's the strategy.